The county courthouse stood only 20 minutes from the motel where I had been living, yet that short drive felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. Sarah parked the car and looked at me before turning off the engine. "Are you ready?" I stared at the courthouse entrance. "I don't know." She smiled gently. "You don't have to feel ready. You only have to tell the truth." For the first time in weeks, I took a deep breath without feeling completely overwhelmed. When we entered the courtroom, I immediately saw Michael and Jason sitting with their attorney. Neither of them looked at me. Michael stared down at a folder resting on the table. Jason kept rubbing his wedding ring over and over. They looked exhausted. Older somehow, the judge entered. Everyone stood. After the formal introductions, the hearing began. Their attorney spoke first. "Your Honor, Mr. Daniel Carter suffered a significant cardiac event. Our clients reasonably believed their father would no longer be capable of living independently. They acted only to protect his financial interests." Sarah quietly wrote a note before standing. "Your Honor, we do not question whether Mr. Carter required medical treatment. We question whether his sons had any legal authority to sell his property." The courtroom became still. Sarah called the first witness, Helen Brooks. She walked to the witness stand, raised her right hand, and took the oath. Sarah began gently. "Ms. Brooks, were you working on the day Mr. Carter underwent surgery?" "Yes." "Did you observe the defendants visiting him?" "I did." "What did you know?" Helen spoke calmly. "Mr. Carter was heavily sedated. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The defendants repeatedly asked to be left alone with him. Did that concern you?" "At the time, only slightly, but afterward." She looked toward me. I realized something wasn't right. The defense attorney stood. "Ms. Brooks, did you actually see anyone forge a signature?" "No." "So you are only describing your personal impressions?" Helen answered without hesitation. "I'm describing exactly what I witnessed." The judge nodded thoughtfully. Sarah called the next witness, the forensic handwriting examiner. Large photographs of the signature appeared on courtroom monitors. He explained each hesitation mark, each unnatural pen stop, each trace stroke. Finally, he concluded, "In my professional opinion, the questioned signature was not naturally written by Mr. Daniel Carter." The courtroom remained silent. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jason lowered his head. The defense attorney quickly stood again. "Expert opinions are not facts. They are interpretations." The handwriting expert nodded. "That is true. But interpretations are based upon measurable characteristics." He pointed toward the enlarged images. "And these characteristics are entirely inconsistent with a genuine signature." Sarah thanked him and returned to counsel table. Then she called the hospital records supervisor. The witness confirmed the exact medication schedule, the exact time Daniel received post-operative sedation, the exact period during which he was medically incapable of understanding complex legal documents. Sarah walked slowly toward the judge. "Your Honor, the power of attorney bears a signature allegedly executed at 3:19 p.m. She held up another document. "Hospital records confirm Mr. Carter received intravenous sedatives less than 20 minutes earlier." She paused. The medical staff documented confusion, impaired awareness, and inability to provide informed consent. The judge carefully reviewed the records. No one spoke, not even the defense. Then Sarah delivered the sentence that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. "If Mr. Carter could not legally consent, he could not legally authorize anyone to sell his home." The defense attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, intent matters. Our clients believed they were acting in their father's best interest." The judge calmly replied, "Intent does not replace legal authority." For the first time that morning, Michael finally looked directly at me. His expression wasn't angry, it wasn't defiant, it looked afraid. The judge announced a short recess. People quietly left their seats. As I stood near the hallway window, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jason. His eyes were red. "Dad." His voice shook. "We never thought this would go this far." I remained silent. He swallowed hard. "Michael said selling the house would solve everything." I believed him. "You believed him," I repeated quietly. "Or you wanted to believe him?" Jason couldn't answer. Before either of us could speak again, Michael hurried over. "Jason." His tone was sharp. "Our lawyer needs us." Jason looked at me one last time before walking away. Sarah stepped beside me. "You noticed that?" "What?" "Jason is beginning to crack." Before I could respond, the courtroom doors opened again. The bailiff announced that proceedings would resume. Everyone returned to their seats. The judge looked toward Sarah. "Counsel, do you have any additional evidence before the court?" Sarah slowly reached into her briefcase. "Yes, Your Honor. I have one final exhibit." She carefully placed a sealed envelope on the evidence table. The handwriting on the front was elegant, familiar, even from across the courtroom. I recognized it immediately. Emily's handwriting. The judge adjusted his glasses. "What is contained in that envelope?" Sarah answered softly. "A letter written years before these events. It has no bearing on ownership, but it explains the purpose of the property, and the truth this family forgot." The judge looked at the envelope for several long seconds, then he spoke. The court will review whether it is admissible. Every eye in the courtroom fixed on that single sealed letter, because no one yet knew that the quiet words written by a mother years earlier were about to change every person sitting in that room. Some people lose their homes to fire, some lose them to storms. I lost mine while lying in a hospital bed, and the people who took it were my own sons. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 68 years old, a retired electrician from Ohio. For more than 4 decades I woke up before sunrise, worked long hours, skipped vacations, and fixed anything that needed fixing so my family would always have a place to call home. That house wasn't just wood and bricks. Every room held a memory. The scratch marks on the kitchen doorway measured my boys' heights as they grew. The old maple tree in the backyard still had the tire swing I built one summer after working 6 straight weekends. My late wife Emily used to say, "A house becomes a home because love stays there." I believed that with all my heart, until one afternoon changed everything. It started with a pain in my chest. I was trimming bushes in the front yard when the pressure spread across my shoulders. My neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, saw me collapse onto the porch steps and called 911 before I could even reach my phone. Fortunately, it wasn't a massive heart attack. The doctors called it a serious warning. I would need surgery and several weeks of recovery. When my sons arrived at the hospital, they looked worried. Michael, my oldest, squeezed my hand. "Dad, don't think about anything except getting better." Jason nodded beside him. "We'll take care of everything." Those words brought me comfort. I had always trusted them. After all, they were my boys. During the next 2 weeks, the hospital became my entire world. Machines beeped through the night. Nurses checked on me every few hours. Physical therapists encouraged me to walk a little farther each day. Michael visited almost every evening. Sometimes Jason came with him. Sometimes he didn't. Whenever I asked about the house, Michael smiled. "Everything's fine." Jason always added the same sentence. "Don't worry about the house." At the time, I thought they were simply trying to protect me from unnecessary stress. Looking back now, those words meant something completely different. One morning, Dr. Collins entered my room carrying a clipboard. "I think you're ready to go home, Daniel." Those 5 words were all I wanted to hear. Home. The place where Emily's favorite rocking chair still faced the living room window. The place where her photograph rested beside the fireplace. The place where I still talked to her every evening, even though she'd been gone for 6 years. Michael texted me that morning. "Sorry, Dad. Big meeting today. Can't pick you up. Just grab a taxi. We'll come by tonight." I wasn't disappointed. People had jobs. Life was busy. I understood. The taxi driver loaded my small suitcase into the trunk and asked for the address. As we drove through familiar streets, I smiled at the neighborhoods I'd known for decades. The grocery store where Emily and I used to shop, the church where we celebrated our 40th anniversary, the little diner that still served the best apple pie in town. Everything looked exactly the same. Until we turned onto my street, something felt different. A large moving truck was parked in front of my house. At first I assumed a neighbor was moving, but as the taxi rolled closer I noticed furniture sitting on my front lawn. Not my neighbor's furniture, mine. Emily's antique dining table, the oak bookshelf I built with my own hands, the porch bench where we drank coffee every Sunday morning. My heart began pounding harder than it had during the heart attack. "Sir?" The taxi driver glanced at me in the mirror. "You okay?" I think you've stopped at the wrong address." He looked at the mailbox. "No, sir." He read the number aloud. It was my address. I slowly stepped out of the taxi. A young couple was directing movers through my front door. Boxes covered the living room floor. A little girl ran across the porch laughing before her parents gently called her back inside. The woman noticed me first. She smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I think there's been a mistake." I pointed toward the house. "I live here." Her smile disappeared. "I'm sorry." She exchanged a confused look with her husband. "We bought this house last week." "No." I shook my head. "That's impossible." The husband reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded set of documents. "We closed through the title company 3 days ago." He looked genuinely concerned. "Your sons handled everything." The world suddenly became very quiet. "My sons?" "Yes." He frowned. "They told us you had moved into long-term care after your surgery." For several seconds I couldn't speak. I simply stared at the front door. The same front door I had painted with Emily every spring. The same front door where my boys stood proudly on their first day of school. The same front door I had locked every night for over 40 years. A mover carried out another box. Across the side, written in thick black marker, were 2 simple words. "Dad's photos." My knees nearly gave out. I reached for my phone with trembling hands. Michael didn't answer. Jason didn't answer either. Straight to voicemail. Agon again. Then I looked toward the entrance one last time. The brass lock I had installed years ago was gone. Someone had replaced it. And for the first time in 42 years, I no longer had a key to my own home. I hadn't heard Emily's handwriting spoken aloud in more than 6 years. Yet somehow, Just knowing she had left a sealed envelope made it feel as though she were still trying to protect our family. Sarah arranged a meeting with the attorney who had prepared our estate plans years earlier. His office sat inside a quiet brick building downtown. Everything about the place felt unchanged. The same polished wooden desk, the same grandfather clock ticking softly in the corner, the same shelves lined with leather-bound law books. Mr. Harrison greeted me with a warm but saddened smile. "Daniel." He shook my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "So do I." He opened a locked filing cabinet and carefully removed a large envelope. Across the front, written in Emily's unmistakable handwriting, were the words Sarah had read to me the night before. Asterisk, to be opened only if our family ever forgets what this house truly means. For a long moment nobody moved. My fingers trembled. "I don't know if I'm ready." Sarah gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to read it alone." I slowly broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and several old photographs. The first photograph showed Michael and Jason as little boys, covered in paint while helping Emily decorate the living room before Christmas. The second showed all four of us planting the maple tree in the backyard. The last photograph was taken on the day we made the final mortgage payment. Emily had written across the bottom, "Finally home. Together forever." My vision blurred. Sarah quietly handed me a tissue. Then I unfolded the letter. Emily's handwriting looked exactly as I remembered. Steady, elegant, full of warmth. "My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, something has happened that neither of us ever wanted. Perhaps I am gone. Perhaps our boys have lost their way. Or perhaps life simply became harder than we imagined. If that day ever comes, remember this. We never built this house because we wanted something expensive. We built it because we wanted our children to always have one place where they would feel safe, forgiven, and loved." I stopped reading for a moment. The room was completely silent. Even the old clock seemed quieter. I continued. "Michael, Jason, if you are reading this with your father, I hope you remember the nights we ate dinner together around the old oak table. I hope you remember your father working overtime every winter so we never missed a mortgage payment. I hope you remember that every nail he hammered into these walls carried a dream for both of you. A home is never measured by its market value. It is measured by the people willing to sacrifice for it." I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. Sarah quietly lowered her eyes. Even Mr. Harrison removed his glasses. The final page was addressed directly to me. "Daniel, if our boys ever make a terrible mistake, don't let anger become the last thing they remember from you. Hold them accountable. Demand honesty, but leave the door open for them to become better men. That will be your greatest gift to them. I love you. Always, Emily." No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Sarah carefully folded the pages. "This letter," she looked at me, "won't decide the legal case." I nodded. "I know. The judge must rule based on evidence." She tapped the stack of documents beside her. "The hospital records, the handwriting expert, the visitor logs, those are what matter legally." She paused. "But this letter explains something evidence never can." "What?" She smiled sadly. "What your family was supposed to stand for." For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized something important. I wasn't fighting simply to recover a house. I was fighting to protect everything Emily and I had spent our lives building. Later that afternoon, Sarah received another phone call. She listened quietly before writing several notes. When she hung up, I noticed a different expression on her face. "What happened?" "The buyers." My heart skipped. "What about them?" "They've agreed to cooperate." "They did?" She nodded. "They're devastated. They had no idea you were still living independently. The husband says your sons repeatedly insisted you had permanently moved into assisted living." I stared out the window. "So they were lied to as well." "Yes. And they're willing to testify under oath." That single decision strengthened our case more than I had expected. Honest buyers, a nurse who trusted her instincts, a handwriting expert, medical records. The truth was finally beginning to come together. 3 days later, Sarah called me into her office. She handed me a folder. "The court has scheduled the first hearing." I looked down at the date. It was only a week away. "Are we ready?" She met my eyes with quiet confidence. "I believe we have enough to prove the documents were fraudulent." She paused before adding one final sentence. "But Daniel." "Yes?" When people realize they're losing, they often become unpredictable. As if on cue, my phone vibrated. A text message from Michael appeared on the screen. "Dad, maybe we should settle this privately before court." It was the first message either of my sons had sent that wasn't filled with excuses. I stared at the words for several seconds, then I locked my phone without replying, because for the first time, this wasn't just between a father and his sons anymore. It was about the truth, and in just a few days, everyone would hear it in open court. I tightened my grip on the phone. "Helen," my voice barely came out. "What is it?" There was a brief silence before she answered. "I don't want to discuss it over the phone." My stomach tightened. "Can we meet?" "Of course." She suggested a small cafe across from the hospital where she often stopped after her shifts. An hour later, I found her sitting alone in the corner, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She stood as I approached. "Mr. Carter." She looked genuinely sorry. "I'm glad you came." I sat across from her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she leaned forward. "The day of your surgery, something happened that has been bothering me ever since." My heartbeat quickened. "You were heavily sedated after the procedure." I nodded. "I don't remember much." "You wouldn't." She took a slow breath. "Most patients don't." She reached into her purse and removed a small notebook. "I keep personal notes after difficult shifts." She flipped through several pages before stopping. "I wrote this because it felt unusual." She looked at me. "Your sons arrived less than an hour after surgery. That's normal." "Yes." She nodded. "What wasn't normal was how determined they were to be alone with you." I frowned. "They asked us several times to leave the room. They said they needed privacy to discuss family finances." I tried to remember nothing, only scattered flashes of bright lights, voices. Then darkness. Helen continued. "You were barely awake. You opened your eyes for only a few seconds at a time. They kept asking if you could sign something." A chill ran through me. "I don't remember signing anything." "I don't think you could have." She hesitated. "I told them the medication might leave you confused. They insisted everything was urgent." My hands slowly formed fists beneath the table. "Did anyone stop them?" "The charge nurse eventually asked them to leave. But before that," she looked down at her notebook, "they had several minutes alone with you." The cafe suddenly felt colder. "I've been asking myself ever since whether I should have reported it." She looked ashamed. "I thought it was simply a family discussing paperwork. No one imagined a house would disappear." I reached across the table. "This isn't your fault." She shook her head. "Maybe not, but I should have trusted my instincts." She handed me a copy of her handwritten notes. Every page was dated, every observation was recorded the same day it happened. It wasn't official evidence, but it established something important. Someone had noticed. Sarah Mitchell read Helen's notes that afternoon. She looked up immediately. "This helps. It establishes a timeline. But we still need stronger evidence." "What kind?" She slid the power of attorney across her desk. "A forensic handwriting examination." Within 2 days, Sarah arranged for an independent document examiner. His office looked more like a laboratory than a law practice. High-resolution scanners, microscopes, specialized lighting. He spent nearly an hour comparing my driver's license, old tax returns, retirement paperwork, birthday cards I had signed for my grandchildren years earlier, against the signature on the power of attorney. He finally removed his glasses. "The similarities are obvious." My heart sank. Then he continued. "Because someone worked very hard to imitate your handwriting." I looked at Sarah. She remained completely still. The expert continued. "There are several hesitation marks. Natural signatures flow continuously. This one doesn't." He enlarged several sections on his monitor. Tiny breaks appeared where the pen had stopped. "There are also tracing characteristics." "So," I asked quietly, "what does that means?" He looked directly at me. "I believe this signature was produced by someone attempting to copy yours." For the first time since leaving the hospital, I had proof that I wasn't imagining any of this. Sarah smiled for the first time. "This changes everything." But our victory lasted only a few minutes. She received another phone call. Her expression immediately became serious. "What is it?" She slowly lowered the receiver. "Your sons." My stomach tightened. "What about them?" "They've started selling the contents of the house." I felt as though someone had punched me in the chest. "No. They've listed furniture online. Your workshop equipment, your wife's piano, the antique dining table, even Emily's china collection. Items accumulated over 40 years were disappearing one by one." I drove past the house that evening. From across the street, I watched strangers carrying boxes to their cars. A young man loaded my woodworking tools into a pickup truck, the same tools I had used to build every bookshelf in that house. I wanted to run across the street, to stop them, to tell them those weren't just possessions, they were pieces of my family's life. But Sarah had warned me. If we interfere now, it could complicate the case. So I stood there, powerless, a man watching strangers carry away his memories. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "I've been reviewing your late wife's estate documents." My wife's. There was one file that had never been opened. My breathing stopped. "What kind of file?" She paused. "A sealed envelope. It was deposited with the attorney who prepared both of your wills. It was marked." She looked back down at the file before reading the handwritten words aloud. "To be opened only if our family ever forgets what this house truly means." I closed my eyes. Emily. Even after all these years, she had somehow seen farther into the future than any of us. And I knew, before that envelope was ever opened, nothing would ever be the same again. For nearly a full minute, I stood on the sidewalk staring at the unfamiliar lock. It wasn't just a different piece of metal. It was a message. Someone had decided that I no longer belonged inside the only home I had ever truly known. The young couple looked uncomfortable. The husband slowly walked toward me. "Sir, are you sure you're okay?" I nodded automatically, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "If we'd known there was any kind of dispute, we never would have bought the place." His wife added, "The title company assured us everything was completely legal." I believed them. They weren't the people who had betrayed me. They were simply another family who thought they had purchased their dream home. I thanked them for speaking honestly. Then I picked up my small suitcase and asked the taxi driver to take me to the nearest hotel. The ride felt much longer than it actually was. I kept replaying the same sentence in my mind. "Your sons handled everything." It made no sense. Michael and Jason knew exactly what that house meant to me. After Emily died, I had told them more than once, "One day the house will be yours, but as long as I'm alive, it's still your mother's home." They had both agreed, or at least I thought they had. That evening, I tried calling them again, no answer. I sent text messages, nothing. Hours passed. Silence. Around midnight, Michael finally replied, "Dad, we're busy. We'll explain everything tomorrow. Please stay calm." No apology, no explanation. Just 4 cold sentences. I barely slept. The next morning I walked into the office of the real estate agency whose name appeared on the buyer's paperwork. The receptionist greeted me politely. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "My name is Daniel Carter." I placed the property address on her desk. "I need to understand why my home was sold." Her expression changed immediately. She disappeared into a back office and returned a few minutes later with the branch manager. "Mr. Carter, would you please come with me?" Inside his office, he opened a thick file. Every page carried official stamps, inspection reports, closing documents, transfer records. Then he stopped on one page. "This is the power of attorney that authorized the sale." He slid the document across the desk. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. At first glance, I stared at it for several seconds. Something felt wrong. The letters were shaped similarly, but not naturally. Almost copied. "I didn't sign this." The manager frowned. "Our records show it was notarized. I was in the hospital." He looked surprised. "The paperwork states you voluntarily granted authority to your sons because of your medical condition." "I never did." Silence filled the room. He carefully folded his hands. "Mr. Carter, if what you're saying is true," he hesitated, "then this is a very serious matter." He printed copies of every document for me. As I stood to leave, he added quietly, "I think you should speak with an attorney immediately." An hour later, I found myself sitting inside the office of Sarah Mitchell. She specialized in estate and property law. Her offices were lined with books thicker than my toolbox manuals from my working days. She listened without interrupting while I explained everything, from the heart attack, to the hospital, to returning home, to strangers living inside my house. When I finished, she remained silent for a long moment. Then she asked one simple question. "Did you sign anything while you were hospitalized?" "I signed surgical consent forms." "Anything else?" "No." She nodded slowly. "Then let's verify every signature." She examined the power of attorney through a magnifying glass. Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't enough to prove forgery." My heart sank. "But," she continued, "it's enough to justify an investigation." Hope returned for the first time since leaving the hospital. Sarah requested copies of my medical records. She asked for admission logs, medication schedules, nursing notes, Vista records, everything. "If someone obtained this document improperly," she said, "the timeline will matter." Before I left, she stopped me. "Daniel." I turned around. "I've practiced law for 23 years. She looked directly into my eyes. "People don't usually lose an entire house by accident." Her words stayed with me all afternoon. Someone had planned this carefully, deliberately. That evening I checked into a small extended-stay motel on the edge of town. The room contained a narrow bed, a tiny refrigerator, a folding table beside the window. It was clean, but it didn't feel like home. I placed Emily's framed photograph on the nightstand. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I couldn't protect our home." For the first time since she passed away, I felt completely alone. The next morning my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar. "Mr. Carter?" A woman's voice sounded hesitant. "Yes, my name is Helen Brooks." She paused. "I was one of the nurses who cared for you after your surgery." I searched my memory. Her name sounded familiar. "I've been thinking about you ever since I heard what happened." My pulse quickened. "There is something about the day you were admitted." She took a slow breath. "That I don't think anyone has told you." And in that instant, I realized my nightmare had only just begun. The courtroom remained silent as the judge examined the sealed envelope. For several long moments no one spoke. Finally, Judge Hayes looked towards Sarah. "Counsel, you've already acknowledged that this letter does not establish ownership of the property." "That's correct, Your Honor." "Then explain why the court should hear it." Sarah stood calmly. "We are not offering this letter as legal proof." She paused before continuing. "We offer it only after the documentary evidence has already established the timeline. the fraudulent power of attorney, and Mr. Carter's inability to give informed consent. She gently rested one hand on the evidence table. This letter simply explains why the property became the subject of this deception. The defense attorney slowly rose. We have no objection, provided the court understands it has no legal weight regarding ownership. Judge Hayes nodded. The objection is noted. He turned toward the clerk. The letter may be read for context only. I looked down at my hands, even though I had already read Emily's words. Hearing them again, in this courtroom, felt entirely different. Sarah unfolded the pages with great care. Her voice was steady, clear, almost gentle. My dearest Daniel. The room became impossibly quiet. Every person seemed to stop breathing. She continued reading. Emily spoke about the first winter we spent in the unfinished house. She described sleeping on a mattress placed directly on the living room floor because we couldn't yet afford bedroom furniture. She wrote about Michael helping me carry boxes before he was even tall enough to reach the doorknob. She remembered Jason falling asleep in my lap while I repaired the kitchen cabinets late one night after work. Then Sarah reached the section addressed to our sons. If you are reading this someday, I hope you remember that your father never measured success by money. He measured it by whether his family felt safe when they walked through the front door. Across the courtroom, Jason slowly lowered his head. Michael stared straight ahead without moving. Sarah continued, if this house is ever sold, let it be because your father freely chooses a new chapter, never because someone decides his life for him. I felt tears running down my face, not because of the house, because I could almost hear Emily speaking those words herself. The judge quietly removed his glasses. Several jurors reached for tissues. Even the court reporter briefly paused before continuing to type. Sarah finished the final paragraph. Forgive each other whenever possible, but never confuse forgiveness with pretending that nothing happened. She carefully folded the letter. That concludes the reading. Silence filled every corner of the courtroom, not dramatic silence, not theatrical silence, the kind of silence that only arrives after everyone has been forced to examine their own conscience. Judge Hayes waited nearly a full minute before speaking. The court appreciates the distinction counsel has made. He looked toward both legal teams. The ownership issue has already been addressed through documentary evidence. He tapped the hospital records. The medical records established that Mr. Carter lacked capacity to execute complex legal documents at the relevant time. He tapped the forensic report. The handwriting analysis identifies significant indicators of forgery. He turned another page. The buyers testified that they relied upon representations made by the defendants regarding their father's permanent incapacity. His eyes finally rested on Michael and Jason. The evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding the validity of the transaction. Michael's attorney stood once more. Your Honor, my clients acknowledge they made mistakes, but they believe they were protecting their father. Judge Hayes looked directly at him. Protecting someone does not permit taking away fundamental property rights without lawful authority. The attorney quietly sat down. For the first time since the hearing began, Michael requested permission to speak. His attorney looked surprised but nodded. Judge Hayes allowed it. Michael slowly stood. His voice sounded nothing like the confident businessman I had known. Dad. He looked at me for only a second before lowering his eyes again. I told myself this was temporary. I kept saying we'd buy another house, a smaller one, closer to us. He swallowed hard. I convinced myself you wouldn't care. He paused. But the truth is, his shoulders began trembling. I never asked what you wanted. The courtroom remained silent. Jason suddenly stood beside his brother. His words came through tears. I signed the papers. I knew something wasn't right, but I was afraid to stop everything. I kept thinking we'd fix it later. There was always supposed to be a later. He covered his face. There wasn't. I listened without interrupting. Part of me wanted to walk across the room and hug my sons. Another part remembered every lonely night in that motel, every unanswered phone call, every stranger carrying away Emily's belongings. Forgiveness suddenly seemed much more complicated than I had imagined. Judge Hayes waited until both men sat down. Then he closed the case file. The court has heard all testimony. He looked toward the attorneys. I will now review the complete record before issuing my decision. The bailiff announced a brief recess. Everyone slowly began leaving the courtroom. Sarah leaned toward me. No matter what happens next, she smiled softly. You gave the court the truth. I nodded. But will the truth be enough? She looked toward the judge's empty chair. In my experience, the truth usually arrives quietly, but once it arrives, it rarely leaves without changing everything. 20 minutes later, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors again. All rise. Judge Hayes returned to the bench carrying a thin folder. He looked across the room one final time. Then he spoke the words every person had been waiting to hear. The court is prepared to announce its ruling. And suddenly, every heartbeat in the courtroom seemed to stop. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Judge Robert Hayes opened the thin folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses. The court has carefully reviewed all testimony, documentary evidence, expert analysis, and applicable law. His calm voice filled every corner of the courtroom. This case is not about whether the defendants loved their father. It is not about whether they believed they were acting wisely. It is about whether they possessed the legal authority to permanently transfer ownership of another person's home. He paused. The evidence demonstrates that they did not. The silence grew even heavier. The medical records established that Mr. Daniel Carter lacked the legal capacity to knowingly execute a power of attorney at the time the document was allegedly signed. He turned another page. The forensic handwriting analysis identifies multiple characteristics consistent with a traced or simulated signature. Another page. The testimony of hospital staff corroborates the unusual circumstances surrounding the execution of that document. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Accordingly, the court declares the power of attorney invalid. I closed my eyes. For weeks I had imagined hearing those words. Now they were real. Judge Hayes continued. Because the power of attorney is void, every action relying upon that document is likewise invalid. The transfer of ownership is hereby rescinded. The title to the property shall immediately revert to Daniel Carter. A quiet gasp spread across the courtroom. The young couple who had unknowingly purchased my home looked relieved rather than disappointed. Judge Hayes addressed them directly. The court finds no evidence that the purchasers participated in or were aware of the fraud. They are innocent purchasers who relied upon false representations. He turned toward the attorneys. The funds exchanged during the transaction shall be restored through the appropriate civil process. The husband quietly nodded. His wife reached for his hand. I felt strangely grateful they had never been my enemies. Judge Hayes wasn't finished. He looked toward Michael and Jason. The court further orders this matter referred to the appropriate authorities for review of potential civil and criminal liability arising from the fraudulent documents presented during this transaction. Michael lowered his head. Jason quietly closed his eyes. Neither man spoke. The gavel struck once. This hearing is concluded. For several seconds no one stood. The courtroom remained suspended in silence, as though everyone needed time to absorb what had just happened. Then Sarah gently touched my arm. Daniel, we won. I looked at her. The words didn't immediately register. Won. It sounded too simple. How could anyone win after losing so much? Outside the courtroom, reporters had already gathered near the courthouse steps. Apparently, local news had become interested after learning an elderly man claimed his own children had sold his house while he was hospitalized. Microphones appeared almost instantly. Mr. Carter, do you have a statement? How does it feel to get your home back? I looked towards Sarah. She gave me a small, encouraging nod. I stepped forward for a moment. I couldn't find the words. Then I said quietly, I didn't come here to defeat my sons. I came here because every person deserves the right to decide what happens to their own life. The reporters fell silent. I hope no family ever has to stand where mine stood today, because lawsuits end, but broken trust. He paused, swallowing the emotion in his throat. Takes much longer to heal. No one asked another question. Sometimes the quietest answers say the most. As the crowd slowly dispersed, someone called my name. Mr. Carter. It was the young couple. The husband extended his hand. I'm Ethan. This is my wife, Rachel. I'm sorry. So am I replied. Rachel smiled sadly. We've already started packing. You don't have to. She shook her head. We couldn't stay there now. Not after knowing what happened. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a small brass key in my hand. I believe. He smiled gently. This belongs to you. I stared at the key resting in my palm. It wasn't my original key. That one had disappeared weeks earlier, but somehow, it still felt like I was holding a piece of my life again. Sarah quietly whispered, take your time before going back. You've been through a lot. I nodded. There is one place I need to visit first. That afternoon, instead of driving home, I stopped at the cemetery. Emily rested beneath a simple gray granite headstone surrounded by white lilies. I knelt beside her grave. We did it. The autumn breeze moved gently through the trees. I got our home back. For several moments I simply sat there, then I smiled through tears. You were right. Our boys lost their way, but maybe. I looked toward the sky. They haven't lost themselves forever. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated. It was another message from Michael. We're sorry. If you'll let us, we'd like to help put everything back the way it was. I stared at the screen. Weeks earlier, I would have answered immediately. Now, I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Some apologies deserve to be heard, but forgiveness needs more than words. The sun was beginning to set as I finally turned my truck toward the neighborhood I had left weeks before. The familiar streets slowly came into view. The maple trees, the old church, the corner diner. Everything looked exactly as I remembered. Except this time, I wasn't returning as the man who had been forced to leave. I was returning as the rightful owner of the life someone else had tried to take away. When I reached the end of the street, my house came into view. The moving truck was gone. The front porch stood quiet beneath the evening light. I parked across the street. For several long moments, I simply looked at the front door, the same door I had dreamed about every night in that lonely motel room. Now it stood only a few steps away. I reached into my pocket, closed my fingers around the brass key, stepped onto the sidewalk and slowly walked toward home. The brass key felt heavier than it should have, maybe because it wasn't just opening a door, it was unlocking 42 years of memories. I stood on the front porch as the evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden boards. The paint on the railing had begun to peel. One of the porch lights leaned slightly to the left. I smiled despite myself. I had been meaning to fix that light for nearly a year. Emily used to laugh every time she noticed it. "You've repaired half the town's electrical problems," she'd tease. "But somehow our own porch light always has to wait." I slipped the key into the lock for one brief second. I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I would find inside, because I wasn't sure I was ready to see how much had changed. The lock clicked. I slowly pushed the front door open. The familiar scent of old wood and furniture polish greeted me first. Then came the silence, not the lonely silence of the motel room, the comforting silence of a place that had witnessed an entire lifetime. I stepped inside. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my boots exactly where it always had. Some sounds never change. The living room looked strangely empty. Several pieces of furniture were gone. The old piano Emily loved to play every Sunday afternoon had disappeared. The antique oak table where we celebrated birthdays and holidays was missing. One wall still carried a faint outline where our family photographs had once hung. Boxes labeled *personal light boss were stacked neatly near the fireplace. Ethan and Rachel had clearly tried to gather everything they believed belonged to me. They had treated the house with more respect than the people who had grown up inside it. I slowly walked toward the fireplace. Emily's favorite rocking chair was still there. I reached out and rested my hand on its worn wooden arm. The fabric had faded over the years. She had refused to replace it. "It isn't beautiful," she'd always say. "It's comfortable." That chair had become the place where she read books to our grandchildren, where she knitted scarves every winter, where she sat beside me during countless quiet evenings after dinner. I closed my eyes. For just a moment, I could almost hear her turning another page. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Instinctively, my head turned. Then I remembered the house was empty. Old homes make noises, especially homes that have spent weeks without the people who truly belong there. I climbed the staircase slowly. Every bedroom carried echoes of another chapter in our lives. Michael's room still had tiny scratches on the closet door from where he had practiced throwing baseballs indoors despite my warnings. Jason's room overlooked the backyard. I remembered helping him build a model airplane on that very windowsill when he was 12 years old. The guest room still contained the quilt Emily had sewn by hand. Nothing expensive, nothing valuable, yet somehow priceless. Finally, I reached our bedroom. The bed remained exactly where we had left it. Her side was still untouched. Her reading glasses rested on the nightstand beside an unfinished novel she had never lived long enough to complete. I sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since returning, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I had won the case, not because the house was mine again, because grief doesn't disappear simply because justice arrives. It only becomes quieter. After several minutes, I wiped my eyes and opened the closet. Near the back sat an old cardboard box. Inside were dozens of family photo albums. I carried one downstairs and opened it on the coffee table. There was Michael learning to ride a bicycle, Jason proudly holding his first fishing rod, Emily laughing so hard that she could barely look at the camera. Then I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. All four of us stood in front of the house on the day we moved in. We looked exhausted. Young hopeful behind the photograph, Emily had written a single sentence. "A family is built one ordinary day at a time." I traced the handwriting with my finger. She had been right. Families aren't destroyed in one day either. They slowly break apart through small choices, one excuse, one lie, one betrayal at a time. As darkness settled outside, I walked into the kitchen and made myself a simple cup of coffee, the same chipped blue mug, the same old coffee maker. For the first time in weeks, life almost felt normal. A sudden knock echoed through the house. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not impatient. I looked toward the front door. No one knew I was coming back tonight. Another knock. I set the mug down and walked through the hallway. The porch light illuminated 2 familiar figures standing quietly outside. Michael, Jason. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked up. Each held a cardboard box filled with items that had been sold before the court stopped the transaction. Old photo frames, Emily's sewing basket, my toolbox. Jason finally broke the silence. "Dad," his voice was barely above a whisper, "we've been trying to buy everything back." Michael swallowed hard. "We know it isn't enough. It never will be." He looked at the floor. "But we didn't want you to come home to an empty house." I looked from one son to the other, then at the boxes they had carried for a long moment. No one moved. Finally, I stepped aside and opened the door a little wider. Not all the way, just enough. Come inside. Neither of them smiled, neither did I. Because all three of us understood something in that moment. Walking back into the house would be much easier than rebuilding the family that had once lived there. For a few seconds, neither Michael nor Jason moved. They stood quietly on the porch, each holding a cardboard box as though it weighed far more than it actually did. Finally, Michael spoke. Are you sure? I nodded once. Come in. They stepped through the doorway slowly. The same doorway they had walked through thousands of times as children. This time, however, they entered with lowered heads instead of laughter. No one spoke while they carried the boxes into the living room. Michael carefully placed Emily's sewing basket beside her rocking chair. Jason set my old toolbox near the fireplace. Inside the boxes were dozens of familiar items, photo albums, holiday decorations, Emily's favorite ceramic vase, the wooden clock that had once hung in our hallway. Some things were still missing. Others had been damaged. But they had clearly spent days tracking down everything they could. Jason finally broke the silence. We contacted everyone who bought something. We explained what happened. Some people returned the items without taking any money. He smiled weakly. Others weren't as forgiving. Michael quietly added, we paid whatever they asked. I looked at both of them. Neither sounded like men trying to defend themselves anymore. They sounded tired, ashamed, and deeply disappointed in the people they had become. I motioned toward the kitchen. Coffee. Both of them looked surprised. Michael almost smiled. I'd like that. A few minutes later, the three of us sat around the small kitchen table, not the beautiful oak table Emily and I had bought decades earlier. That one still hadn't been recovered, just an old folding table Ethan and Rachel had left behind. Somehow, it didn't matter. The coffee tasted exactly the way it always had. For several minutes, the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock. Finally, Michael spoke. I owe you the truth. I folded my hands and waited. When you were in the hospital, I was terrified. He looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. I kept thinking about Mom, and then he hesitated. I started thinking about money. I convinced myself the house was too large, too expensive. I told myself selling it was practical. Jason slowly shook his head. I knew Dad would never agree. So why did you sign the papers? I asked quietly. He closed his eyes because it was easier than standing up to my brother. No excuses, no blaming lawyers, no blaming stress, just the truth. Michael wiped his eyes. I even told the buyers that you'd be happier somewhere else. His voice broke. I never stopped to ask where you wanted to be happy. The room fell silent again. I looked around the kitchen, the worn cabinets, the faded curtains Emily had sewn herself, the small crack in the ceiling that I had promised to repair every summer. Then I looked back at my sons. When your mother and I bought this place, I began softly. We had almost nothing. You boys shared one bedroom. We used lawn chairs as dining room furniture. Michael smiled faintly. I remember. We couldn't afford a television. Jason laughed through his tears. So you told us bedtime stories instead. I nodded. Exactly. I looked toward Emil's photograph sitting on the counter. Those stories, they were worth more than any house. Both of my sons listened without interrupting. I continued. You thought this home was my greatest treasure. I slowly shook my head. It wasn't. You were. Their eyes filled with tears again. But treasure has to be protected. I looked at Michael, not controlled. Then at Jason. And never taken for granted. Neither of them spoke. They simply nodded. I stood and walked to the fireplace. From the mantel, I picked up the framed photograph taken on the day Emily and I made our final mortgage payment. I handed it to Michael. Do you remember this day? He studied the picture for a long moment, then he smiled sadly. Mom cried. She did. Jason laughed softly. You danced with her in the living room. I did. There wasn't even any music. There didn't need to be. The three of us shared the first genuine smile we'd had in a very long time. Not because everything had been repaired, but because honesty had finally entered the room. Michael carefully placed the photograph back on the mantel. I know we don't deserve another chance, he looked at me, but if you'll let us, we'd like to earn one. I walked to the front window. Outside, the maple tree Emily and I had planted years ago swayed gently in the evening breeze. Its branches were stronger now than when we first placed it into the ground. Not because it had avoided storms, because it had survived them. Without turning around, I spoke quietly. I can't pretend none of this happened. Neither son answered. I won't forget what you did. The room remained silent. Then I continued. But I also won't let the worst decision of your lives become the last chapter of our family. Behind me, I heard both of them begin to cry. I finally turned to face them. Forgiveness isn't something I can give you today. I smiled gently. It's something we'll build together, one day at a time, just like your mother and I built this home. Michael stepped forward first, then Jason. The three of us embraced for the first time since Emily's funeral. No words, just quiet tears. Outside, the last light of evening settled across the front porch, a porch that had witnessed scraped knees, birthday parties, holiday dinners, arguments, laughter, loss. And now, the beginning of healing. Several months later, the oak dining table had finally been returned. The piano was restored. The family photographs once again covered the hallway walls. Every Sunday afternoon, Michael and Jason came over for coffee. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply sat together in comfortable silence. Healing wasn't quick. Trust wasn't magically restored, but little by little, we began building something new. One crisp autumn morning, I placed fresh white lilies beside Emily's photograph. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "Our home is still standing." For a moment, sunlight streamed through the living room window and illuminated the family picture on the mantel. I smiled, not because I had won a lawsuit, not because I had gotten my house back, but because I finally understood what Emily had tried to teach us all those years ago. A house can be bought, a house can be sold, a house can even be stolen, but a home, a real home, is rebuilt every time people choose love over pride, truth over comfort, and forgiveness over bitterness. If this story reminded you of someone you love, don't wait for tomorrow to tell them. Sometimes the strongest family isn't the one that never breaks, it's the one willing to rebuild together after it does. The end.